In the gilded cage of modern architecture, Julian Croft was a demigod. His name was etched onto the cornerstones of skyscrapers that pierced the clouds, monuments of glass and steel that reshaped skylines from New York to Shanghai. He designed structures of breathtaking beauty and brutalist efficiency, yet he lived within a fortress of solitude, his own heart a blueprint for an empty cathedral. His life was a meticulously curated collection of successes, haunted by a single, dissonant chord. The ghost of a melody, the only heirloom from a mother whose face was a blank canvas. One torrential autumn evening, with the city weeping against the floor-to-ceiling windows of his minimalist penthouse, the silence became a physical weight. A multi-billion-dollar deal to design a new World Trade Center in Dubai had just been finalized. His team was celebrating at Per Se, popping champagne that cost more than a family car. But the triumph tasted like ash. Driven by an impulse he couldn't name, a desperate flight from his own gilded perfection, he dismissed his driver, slid behind the wheel of his meticulously restored 1968 Jaguar E-Type, and surrendered to the storm. He drove with no destination, the hypnotic rhythm of the wipers a metronome counting out the beats of his discontent. He left the glittering canyons of Manhattan behind, crossing the bridge into the forgotten boroughs, where the city's pulse slowed to a more human rhythm. It was there, on a rain-slicked street, in a neighborhood, clinging stubbornly to its brick-and-mortar past, that the Jaguar, a masterpiece of engineering, coughed, sputtered, and died. A curse, sharp and bitter, escaped his lips. Stranded, Julian Croft, the master builder, undone by a faulty wire. As he prepared to make the call that would dispatch a team of security and mechanics, a warm, buttery light spilled onto the wet asphalt. It emanated from a small, family-run restaurant, Nonna's Table, its hand-painted sign a beacon against the deluge. It was everything his world was not, cluttered, dated, but radiating a palpable warmth. The choice was simple. Sit in a dead six-figure car wearing a bespoke Tom Ford suit, or swallow his pride and get a cup of coffee. A bell tinkled merrily as he pushed open the heavy oak door. The air inside was a rich tapestry of garlic, simmering tomatoes and yeast. Red and white checkered tablecloths adorned a handful of tables. An elderly woman with flour dusting her apron was kneading dough behind a counter, while in a far corner, a young woman in a simple waitress's uniform was clearing a table. A small girl, no older than 5, sat at a nearby table, her head drooping with sleep as she colored in a well-worn book. Julian felt like an alien species. His suit was an affront to the room's gentle humility. He took a table in the shadows, his presence a discordant note in the restaurant's quiet symphony. The young waitress approached, her movements tired but graceful. There were faint shadows under her eyes, the telltale sign of exhaustion, but her smile was genuine. "Rough night to be out," she said, her voice soft. "Coffee?" "Please," Julian replied, his own voice sounding harsh and clipped in the cozy space. "Black." As she turned to get the coffee, the little girl at the corner table began to fuss, her coloring forgotten. A small, sleepy whimper escaped her lips. The waitress went to her immediately, her expression softening with a tenderness so profound it was almost painful for Julian to witness. She knelt down, stroking the child's hair. "Just a little longer, sweet pea," she murmured. "Mama's almost done." The child, whose name was apparently Lily, whimpered again, on the verge of tears. The waitress leaned in close, her lips near the girl's ear, and began to hum. Julian froze. The world stopped. The heavy ceramic mug in his hand felt weightless. It wasn't the broken fragment that echoed in his dreams. It was the whole melody, a complete, soaring piece of music that resonated not in his ears, but in the very marrow of his bones. It was a current of electricity shooting up his spine, a key turning in a lock he never knew existed. His meticulously controlled world shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. Then she began to sing, her voice not a professional performance, but an intimate, loving whisper meant only for her child. And for the first time in his 42 years, Julian Croft heard the words that gave his phantom melody a soul. The lighthouse stands on shores of grey, to guide the ships that lose their way. The ocean sighs, the salt spray flies. My little star, close your eyes. Each word was a revelation, a piece of a puzzle he had long since abandoned. It was a song of guidance, of steadfastness in a storm. His hand trembled, the coffee sloshing over the rim of the mug. The waitress, unaware of the cataclysm she had caused, continued the second verse. The light will turn to watch you sleep, while all the silent secrets keep, until the sun begins to rise. My little star, close your eyes. The room seemed to tilt. The scent of garlic and tomatoes vanished, replaced by the deafening roar of his own heartbeat. This stranger, this tired waitress in a cheap restaurant, was singing the anthem of his existence, the one and only legacy of his unknown mother. How could this be possible? Soothed by the familiar tune, the little girl's head finally rested on the table, her breathing evening out into the soft rhythm of sleep. The waitress kissed her daughter's temple, a gesture of pure, unadulterated love. When she looked up, her gaze met Julian's. He was staring, his face a mask of shock, his eyes wide with an intensity that was both terrifying and desperate. She saw a strange man in a ridiculously expensive suit. He saw the oracle of his entire life. He had to know. The dead jaguar, the billion-dollar deal, the empire he had built. It all turned to dust. In that moment, in the humble warmth of Nonna's table, the architect of skylines was just a lost boy who had, after a lifetime of searching, finally heard the siren song of home. The silence stretched between them, thick and charged. In her eyes, he was a threat, an anomaly. Her hand instinctively rested on her sleeping daughter's shoulder. In his eyes, she was a ghost, a keeper of a sacred text he'd only ever known in fragments. His mind, trained to deconstruct problems into their component parts and solve for X, went into overdrive. The initial shock gave way to a lifetime of cultivated cynicism. It was a grift. It had to be. Someone had leaked his obsession with the melody. His private investigators had been searching for it for 2 decades. This was just the most audacious, most personal con he'd ever encountered. He rose from his chair, his tall frame casting a long, intimidating shadow over her small table. He moved with the predatory grace of a man accustomed to owning any room he entered. "My name is Clara," she said, her voice quiet but laced with a protective firmness. Her chin was up. She would not be cowed. "Can I help you with something, sir?" Julian ignored the offered name, his voice a low, dangerous hum. "The song. The lullaby you were just singing. Where did you learn it?" Clara blinked, taken aback by the raw aggression in his tone. I'm sorry. It's just a song I sing for my daughter." "It is not just a song." Julian's voice was a blade. The iron control he prided himself on was beginning to corrode. "That song is private. It belongs to my family." A flicker of disbelief, then righteous anger flashed in Clara's eyes. She'd dealt with drunks, creeps, and entitled customers. But this was something else entirely. This man was radiating a desperate energy that felt genuinely unhinged. "I think you're deeply mistaken," she said, her voice acquiring an edge of steel. "That was my great-grandmother's song. She sang it to my grandmother, who sang it to my mother. Now I sing it to Lily. It has been in my family for almost a century. It belongs to us." Her conviction was a physical force. There was no deceit in her eyes, only the fierce pride of a woman defending her heritage. This wasn't the performance of a con artist. This was the fury of someone whose most sacred possession was being claimed by an arrogant stranger. Julian's carefully constructed theory of a scam began to fracture, replaced by a profound, disorienting confusion. "Your great-grandmother?" he pressed, his mind racing. "What was her name?" "Her name was Martha, and I fail to see how that is any of your business." "Clara, is this man bothering you?" The old woman from behind the counter, Nonna herself, was approaching, holding a heavy wooden rolling pin with the casual menace of a seasoned professional. Julian held up a hand, a gesture of pacification. His usual tactics, intimidation, power, money, were failing him. He needed a new strategy. He needed to do the one thing he despised, show vulnerability. He retreated a step and slid into the booth opposite her, an act that was both an invasion and a supplication. "My name is Julian Croft," he said, his voice stripped of its earlier aggression, replaced by a weariness that was utterly genuine. "I was an orphan, left at a church doorstep as a newborn. I never knew my parents. The only thing I have from my mother is this." He reached inside his perfectly tailored shirt and pulled out a chain. Hanging from it was a heavy, platinum locket, its modern, clean lines a stark contrast to its age. It wasn't tarnished, but it was worn smooth in places from a lifetime of contact with his skin. He laid it on the checkered tablecloth. He pressed a nearly invisible clasp, and it opened. One side was empty, designed for a photograph that had never been there. The other side was not engraved, but held a complex, miniature inlay of a different, darker metal. It depicted a tall, slender lighthouse, its beam cutting through a stormy night, aimed at a single, 8-pointed star. Clara's gaze dropped to the locket. Her defensive posture slackened. Her eyes widened, not with simple surprise, but with the dawning, earth-shattering light of recognition. She looked from the intricate inlay to Julian's face, a silent question in her eyes. "The light will turn to watch you sleep," she whispered, reciting a line from the Lullaby. Her eyes were locked on the image in the locket. "While all the silent secrets keep." It was a confirmation, a fusion of symbol and sound that defied all logic. "My great-grandmother, Martha. She was a silversmith's apprentice before she became a maid," Clara said, her voice now a hushed, awe-struck whisper. She used to sketch this exact image, the lighthouse and the North Star. She said it was a symbol of a love that could weather any storm, a promise to always find your way back home. Julian felt a wave of vertigo so intense he gripped the edge of the table. This was real. The connection was irrefutably, terrifyingly real. This exhausted waitress, in this forgotten corner of the city, held the architect's blueprint to his own life. "I need your help," he said, the words feeling alien and clumsy on his tongue. He was a man who gave help, who brought solutions, who commanded outcomes. He never, ever asked. "I need to know everything, everything your family knows about that song, about that symbol." Clara looked at her sleeping daughter, at her small, scuffed shoes, and the slight fraying at the collar of her coat. She thought of the stack of nursing school textbooks in her tiny apartment, paid for with tips and grueling double shifts. Her life was a carefully balanced equation of survival, and now this man, who looked as if he designed the very buildings that cast shadows over her world, was claiming a piece of her history, the one thing of value her family had ever owned. Why should I help you? She asked, her voice regaining its strength. This lullaby, this story, it's all I have left of them. It's personal, it's ours. Julian understood. It was a transaction, and he hadn't put anything on the table. Because, he began, leaning forward, his gaze locking with hers, his intensity now focused not as a weapon, but as a plea. I believe that Lullaby is a bridge built a long time ago. My life has been on one side, and yours on the other. And I believe the truth of who I am, of who we are, is waiting in the middle. I will pay any price to find it. He saw the conflict in her eyes, the instinct to protect her family's legacy versus the undeniable pull of this impossible mystery. He had to speak the only language he was truly fluent in. "I'll make you a proposition, Clara," he said, his voice shifting back to the familiar, confident cadence of a man closing a deal. "Quit this job, right now. I will pay you a salary, triple what you make here, to work exclusively for me. Your only job will be to help me uncover this story. I will cover your nursing school tuition in full. I will move you and your daughter into a safe, comfortable apartment. All of your expenses will be taken care of. In return, I need your memories, your family's stories, your help." Clara stared at him, dumbfounded. The offer was ludicrous, a fantasy whispered by a dark, brooding stranger. It could be a trap, it could be dangerous. But then she looked at Lily, sleeping so peacefully, oblivious to the precariousness of their existence. She thought of the constant, gnawing anxiety about rent, about a sudden illness, about the dream of a nursing career that felt perpetually out of reach. Julian's offer wasn't just money, it was freedom. It was a future for her daughter. And deeper than that, there was the mystery itself. The locket on the table was a tangible piece of evidence. Her great-grandmother Martha had always been spoken of in hushed, reverent tones, a woman of great loyalty and a great, unspoken sadness. Perhaps this was her chance to understand her own history, too. "All right," she said, the word a shaky exhalation. "All right, Mr. Croft, I'll help you." A tidal wave of relief, so potent it nearly staggered him, crashed over Julian. It was the first true light he'd seen in the long, grey twilight of his life. He pulled out a stark white business card made of thick, unbendable cardstock and a fountain pen. "This is my personal cell," he said, scribbling a second number on the back. "And this is for Marcus Thorne, my head of security. He will arrange everything. A car will pick you and your daughter up tomorrow morning. We'll begin immediately." He stood, his presence once again commanding the space. He placed a thick stack of $100 bills on the table, enough to cover his coffee and serve as a down payment on his sincerity. "Thank you, Clara," he said, using her name for the first time. It felt like the signing of a contract, the sealing of a strange and fateful alliance. As Julian Croft walked out of the warm, garlic-scented haven of Nonna's table and back into the cold, cleansing rain, he felt a tectonic shift in the foundations of his own soul. The hollow man who had entered was gone. In his place was a man with a blueprint, a man with a purpose. The project was no longer about steel and glass. It was about flesh and blood. The hunt was on, not for a contract, but for a ghost, for a mother, and for the full, unwritten story of the lighthouse and the star. The next morning, Julian's world of sterile precision collided with Clara's world of organized chaos. While he was remotely directing a multi-million-dollar operation from his glass-walled home office, Clara was nervously packing a duffel bag and a child's unicorn-themed suitcase in her cramped third-floor walk-up. A gleaming black Mercedes Maybach was parked outside, looking as out of place as a spaceship on her block. Marcus Thorne, a man whose quiet watchfulness spoke of a past in federal service, had personally installed a state-of-the-art car seat for Lily. Their first stop was not one of Julian's sleek offices, but a place Clara had chosen, her grandmother's house in a quiet, tree-lined suburb which had stood empty since her death a year ago. Clara hadn't had the emotional fortitude to sort through a lifetime of memories. Julian arrived with Marcus, expecting to find Clara intimidated by the sudden upheaval. Instead, she seemed imbued with a new sense of mission. "Grandma Beatrice saved everything," Clara explained, her voice steady as she led them into the house. It smelled of cedar, dust, and faint, lingering perfume. She said objects held echoes of the people who loved them. The house was a museum of a life well lived. Doilies on every surface, a collection of porcelain birds, and walls covered in framed photos. Clara as a gap-toothed child, her late mother, and a woman with kind, sad eyes. Beatrice. And in the oldest, most faded photos, another woman with a determined chin and a loyal gaze, Great-Grandma Martha. "The attic," Clara said, a certainty in her voice. "She had a chest up there. She called it her legacy box." Marcus, ever the pragmatist, tested the rickety pull-down ladder before they ascended into the dimly lit space. A single beam of sunlight from a dusty dormer window cut through the gloom, illuminating a universe of dancing dust motes. There, in the corner, sat a large, sea-worn wooden trunk, bound in tarnished brass. As Marcus expertly picked the rusted lock, Julian felt a jolt of adrenaline that dwarfed any he'd ever felt in a boardroom. This wasn't a deal. This was a reckoning. The trunk creaked open, releasing the scent of old paper and dried lavender. The top layers were filled with family heirlooms, baby shoes, a pressed corsage, a bundle of Clara's childhood report cards. But as Clara carefully excavated deeper, the artifacts grew older, more mysterious. Bundles of letters written in elegant, looping script, tied with silk ribbon. Sepia photographs of stern-faced men and women she didn't recognize. And at the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, was a heavy, leather-bound ledger. Clara lifted it out, as if it were a holy relic. The leather was cracked with age. Embossed on the cover, barely visible, was a single, stylized M. "Martha's journal," she breathed. They brought it downstairs, clearing a space on the formal dining room table. Lily, fascinated by this new adventure, was happily occupied with a sketchbook and a new set of colored pencils provided by the ever-prepared Marcus. Clara opened the journal. The pages were filled with her great-grandmother's precise, disciplined handwriting. The entries began over 70 years ago. They chronicled Martha's life as a young woman in service, her hopes, her fears. And then they found the name that changed everything. November 3rd, 1951. I have begun my new post at the Blackwood estate on the North Shore. It is a formidable place, more fortress than home, ruled by Mr. Sterling Blackwood, a man who seems to be made of ice and ambition. My charge is his only daughter, Miss Eleanor. She is 18, with a spirit like a caged bird. She paints in secret, capturing light and color in a house that has none. Her father disapproves, calling it a frivolous pastime, unfit for a Blackwood. I believe it is the only thing that keeps her alive. Julian's breath caught in his throat. Eleanor Blackwood. Clara continued to read aloud, her voice a steady anchor in the swirling currents of the past. The journal painted a heartbreaking picture of a forbidden friendship between the loyal maid and the lonely heiress, trapped by her tyrannical father. May 16th, 1952. Eleanor has a secret love. His name is Thomas, a musician who plays piano at a small club in the village. He has nothing to his name but the calluses on his fingers and a heart full of symphonies. I help her sneak away to see him. Her father would destroy him, and her if he knew. When she is with Thomas, the light she paints returns to her own eyes. Mr. Blackwood is grooming her to marry a man of his choosing, a union to merge two corporate dynasties. He speaks of it as if she is a stock certificate to be traded. Julian felt a profound, aching connection to this phantom father, this musician who dared to love above his station. It explained the soulfulness of the lullaby. Then came the entry that was the epicenter of their search. August 29th, 1952. Eleanor is with child, Thomas's child. She is both terrified and fiercely joyful. Her father, Mr. Blackwood, would see this not as a life, but as a stain upon his legacy. We must hide this. Last night, Thomas played a new melody for her on the piano, a simple, beautiful tune he composed for their baby. Eleanor, a gifted poet, wrote the words. It is about their love, a lighthouse in a storm, and the child, their little star. They call it the Lullaby. They sang it for me. It was a promise whispered against a coming storm. There it was, the lullaby's genesis. It wasn't just a song, it was a vow of love, a piece of art created by his mother and father for him. The journal's tone grew more desperate. It chronicled Eleanor's secret pregnancy, hidden with Martha's help in a small, rented room in a nearby town. It described Sterling Blackwood's mounting suspicion and his tightening control over his daughter. The final entries were a frantic, tear-stained scrawl. April 12th, 1953. He knows. Mr. Blackwood found out. He came to the room today like a thunderclap. His rage was a cold, silent thing, far more terrifying than shouting. He called Thomas a parasite. He told Eleanor she was a vessel for his legacy, and she had allowed it to be polluted. He dragged her away. He said he would not allow a bastard to derail the Blackwood destiny. He said he would handle the problem. April 17th, 1953. Eleanor is gone. Her father claims he sent her to a private clinic in Europe to recover from a nervous breakdown. He threatened me. He said if I ever spoke a word of this, he would ensure my family and I would be destitute forever. The baby, Eleanor's beautiful boy, was born 3 days ago. A doctor, loyal to Mr. Blackwood, oversaw the birth. They took him immediately. They are sending him to an orphanage. Before they took her, Eleanor managed to press something into my hand. The platinum locket Thomas had designed, and I had helped craft. She begged me to make sure her son had it. It was the only piece of them she could give him. I have failed her. I have failed them all. A little boy is lost in the world, and his mother has been erased. The journal ended. The rest of the pages were starkly, achingly blank. The room was utterly silent. Clara gently closed the book. Her face was ashen. She looked at Julian, and the billionaire, the architect, the employer, vanished. She saw only the infant from the journal, the little star her great-grandmother had mourned in secret for the rest of her life. "My God," Clara whispered, tears finally tracing paths down her cheeks. "She carried this for you, for your mother. This whole time." Julian was drowning in a maelstrom of emotions, a searing hatred for this Sterling Blackwood, a profound sorrow for the young lovers he never knew, and a deep, soul-shattering gratitude for Martha, the maid who had kept his story safe. He looked at Clara, the nursing student, the great-granddaughter of his mother's only ally. Their lives weren't just connected by a song. Their families were woven together by a tapestry of love, loyalty, and tragedy. She was not just the key to his past. She was an inseparable part of it. Marcus, who had been listening from the doorway, his face grim, finally spoke. His voice cut through the emotional haze with clinical precision. "Sterling Blackwood," he said, already typing into a secure tablet. CEO and founder of Blackwood Pharmaceuticals, now 95 years old, one of the most powerful and reclusive figures in corporate America. If he was willing to go to these lengths 70 years ago, he will not hesitate to crush us now. Julian's jaw set like concrete. The grief in his heart was crystallizing into something harder, sharper. Purpose. "I don't care," Julian said, his voice a low growl of controlled fury. "He stole my mother. He tried to extinguish my father's memory. He tried to make me a non-entity. He failed. Marcus, find him, and find out what really happened to my mother. Find Eleanor Blackwood." The project had a new blueprint. It was no longer a search for a story. It was the design for a reckoning. Marcus Thorne's investigation moved with the silent, lethal efficiency of a shark. The name Blackwood opened doors into a world of old money, cutthroat corporate law, and secrets buried under decades of influence. The initial report was delivered to Julian's penthouse in less than 48 hours. Sterling Blackwood was alive and, despite his 95 years, still the undisputed tyrant of his empire, ruling from the same formidable North Shore estate Martha had described. But the report contained a bombshell that eclipsed everything else. Marcus's team, using deep web data mining and a network of informants, could find no record of Eleanor Blackwood ever traveling to Europe in 1953. No passport records, no ship manifests, no clinic admission forms. She had vanished from the face of the earth, right here in New York. Digging deeper, they found it. A committal order, sealed by a private judge and signed by Sterling Blackwood. On April 16, 1953, Eleanor Blackwood, aged 19, was admitted to Serenity Meadows, a private long-term psychiatric institution in rural Connecticut. The diagnosis: severe postnatal psychosis and dangerous hysteria. The prognosis: permanent institutionalization. She had been a patient there for 70 years. She was alive. The words slammed into Julian with the force of a physical impact. He had spent his life mourning a ghost. He had imagined a mother who had died of a broken heart, a tragic, romantic figure. The reality, that she had been alive all this time, locked away, a prisoner of her own father's ambition, was a horror beyond comprehension. The grief he had carried like a smooth, worn stone in his heart exploded into jagged shards of rage. "He didn't just send her away," Julian snarled, pacing the vast expanse of his living room, the city lights below, mocking his turmoil. "He buried her alive." Clara, who had been sitting with him, her presence a small, steady flame in his storm, felt a cold dread wash over her. "All those years," she whispered. "My great-grandmother died believing she was gone forever." "He wanted her erased," Marcus said grimly, scrolling through the file on his tablet. "Serenity Meadows is notorious. It's a 5-star prison for the inconvenient relatives of the ultra-wealthy. Access is hermetically sealed. Sterling Blackwood is her sole legal guardian. He controls her medical care, her finances, her contact with the outside world. He has her in a legal and physical cage." "Then we will tear the cage apart," Julian declared, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. He looked at Marcus. "Get me a meeting with him. I want to see this man." "Sir, a direct approach is tactically unwise," Marcus advised. "He'll deny everything. He'll bury us in litigation." "Let him," Julian said, his eyes like chips of flint. "I don't want to surprise him. I want him to know his 70-year-old secret is out. I want him to see the problem he failed to handle. I want to look him in the eye and tell him I'm coming to reclaim what he stole." 3 days later, Julian's Maybach glided through the oppressive wrought-iron gates of the Blackwood estate. It was a Gothic masterpiece of granite and slate, designed to intimidate, not welcome. As they crunched up the long gravel driveway, Julian felt a knot of ice form in his stomach. This was the house his mother had tried to escape. A butler with a face like carved stone led them into a cavernous, two-story library. The air smelled of old leather and furniture polish. Seated behind a desk, the size of a small boat, was Sterling Blackwood. He was skeletal, his skin like translucent parchment, stretched over a frame of sharp angles. But his eyes, sunken deep in their sockets, were terrifyingly alert and intelligent. They were the eyes of a predator that had never missed a kill. He did not rise. "Mr. Croft," he said, his voice a dry, papery rasp. "I was told your business was of the utmost urgency. My time is a finite and valuable commodity. Speak." Julian walked to the desk and placed the platinum locket on the gleaming, antique wood. Sterling Blackwood glanced at it. For a nanosecond, a flicker of something, annoyance, recognition, disturbed the placid surface of his composure. Then it was gone. "A piece of jewelry," he said dismissively. "I am not a collector." "It belonged to your daughter, Eleanor," Julian said, his voice a block of ice. "My mother." The old man's eyes narrowed. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He slowly steepled his long, skeletal fingers. "I am not familiar with that name," he said, the lie spoken with the casual authority of a man whose words create reality. "My daughter was a troubled girl. Her mind was fragile, prone to delusions." "Was Thomas a delusion?" Julian pressed, his anger a tightly coiled spring. "Was the son she carried a delusion? The son you had ripped from her arms and discarded like trash? Was I a delusion, Mr. Blackwood?" A faint, reptilian smile touched Sterling's thin lips. It was all the confirmation Julian needed. "Ah," the old man breathed. "The musician's offspring. I see the resemblance now. You have his intensity, a brutish, unrefined quality. He was a fortune hunter who poisoned my daughter's mind with romantic drivel, threatening to dilute a bloodline I have spent a century perfecting. I did what was necessary to protect her from her own weakness, to preserve the sanctity of the Blackwood name. You call locking a 19-year-old girl in a mental institution for 70 years protection?" Julian's voice dripped with contempt. "You destroyed her life to protect your precious name." "I preserved her life," Sterling retorted, his voice gaining a chilling strength. "Look at you. You seem to have thrived on your own. My actions inadvertently forged you in a fire of ambition you never would have known. You should be grateful. As for Eleanor, she is safe. She is calm. Her episodes are managed with the finest medical care. It is a far more dignified existence than the one she would have chosen for herself." The man's absolute lack of remorse was a monument to psychopathy. He saw his cruelty not as a sin, but as a sound business decision. "I want to see her," Julian demanded. Sterling let out a dry, rattling chuckle. "Impossible. I am her legal guardian. Her well-being is my sole responsibility. She is in a delicate, peaceful state. The sudden appearance of a reminder of her past trauma would be catastrophic for her mental health. I cannot permit it." "You're not protecting her," Julian said, a sudden, blinding insight cutting through his rage. "You're afraid of her. You're terrified that if she sees me, she might remember, that she might wake up, that your 70-year secret might come screaming into the light." "I am afraid of nothing," Sterling snapped, his icy composure finally cracking. "Least of all the sentimental theatrics of a boy playing detective. This audience is over. Leave my property, and I strongly advise you to abandon this crusade. My influence extends into corridors you cannot even conceive of. You have built a respectable empire, Mr. Croft. It would be a tragedy if it were to crumble to dust." It was a declaration of war. Julian stared at the ancient monster behind the desk, a cold, diamond-hard resolve forming in his soul. This was no longer about a reunion. It was about liberation. It was about justice. He turned and walked toward the door. Just before he exited, he paused and looked back at the architect of his life's pain. "You made one critical miscalculation," Julian said, his voice resonating in the tomb-like silence of the library. "When you tried to erase the musician's son, you didn't just create an orphan. You created an enemy with the resources to tear your world down stone by stone. And I will not stop until she is free." As he strode out of the oppressive mansion and into the clean air, the battle lines were irrevocably drawn. Sterling Blackwood had legacy, influence, and 70 years of lies on his side. But Julian Croft had a lifetime of righteous fury, a fortune built for war, and something the old man had never anticipated: the great-granddaughter of his mother's only friend, a woman with a quiet strength and a legacy of her own, ready to fight alongside him. The war against Sterling Blackwood was a silent, brutal affair, fought in the arenas of law, finance, and information. The old man unleashed his arsenal immediately. Julian's companies were besieged by sudden, aggressive SEC inquiries. His international projects were snarled in inexplicable regulatory red tape. A smear campaign, painting him as a ruthless corporate predator, began to circulate in the financial press. Blackwood was trying to bleed him, to force him onto the defensive. But Julian was unshakable. He diverted a 9-figure sum into a war chest, hired the most formidable legal team money could buy, and tasked Marcus with one mission: find a way into Serenity Meadows. Clara, meanwhile, proved to be more than just a keeper of memories. She threw herself into her nursing studies with a new, ferocious intensity. She spent her nights poring over medical journals and case studies on long-term institutionalization, geriatric care, and the effects of psychotropic medications. "If we're going to get her out, we need to understand what they've done to her," she told Julian, her exhaustion eclipsed by her determination. She was no longer just a participant. She was a strategist. Marcus's team finally found a crack in Blackwood's legal fortress. A recently enacted patients' rights law in Connecticut, designed to combat elder abuse, contained a powerful provision. It allowed a direct blood relative, upon providing definitive proof of kinship, to petition the court for an independent medical evaluation of a patient in long-term care, regardless of existing guardianship. Sterling could control the doctors at Serenity Meadows, but he couldn't control a court-appointed, independent physician. It was their battering. The silence in the sun-drenched suite was a fragile, crystalline thing, shattered by the echo of a 70-year-old melody. For Julian, the world had compressed to the space of a single breath held too long. He knelt before the ghost in the wingback chair, her frail, papery hand lost in his, and felt the tectonic plates of his own history grinding into a new and agonizing alignment. This was not the triumphant discovery of a long-lost mother. It was the archaeological unearthing of a ruin, a beautiful structure systematically dismantled until only the foundation of a soul remained. Eleanor's eyes, those vacant blue portals to a forgotten world, had found his. But the gaze was a refraction, seeing through him to a past he could only inhabit through her memory. Thomas. The name was a wisp of sound, a dry leaf skittering across pavement, yet it carried the weight of a lifetime of love and loss. It was a name he had only just learned, the name of the musician who had given him half his DNA and the entirety of his life's phantom anthem. "No," Julian managed, his voice a raw, splintered thing. A universe of feeling, of sorrow, of rage, of a desperate, filial love was strangling him. He fought to anchor her, to pull her from the depths of 1953 into the harsh light of the present. It's Julian, your son, your little star. The words, the final, precious words of the lullaby, were the key. He watched, breathless, as a flicker of lucidity ignited deep within her. It was not a gentle dawn, but a painful, convulsive surge of lightning, illuminating the ravaged landscape of her mind. The vacant placidity crumbled. Her face, a mask of serene emptiness for decades, contorted with the sudden, overwhelming agony of memory. The love, the secret, the baby, the theft. It all came rushing back, not as a narrative, but as a tidal wave of pure, undiluted emotion. "My baby," she sobbed, the sound a terrible wrenching cry of a wound ripped open after a lifetime of scarring over. Her grip on his hand became a vice, a desperate, primal connection. "They told me you were gone, my beautiful boy." They lied. He gathered her into his arms, this fragile, broken woman who was his mother. The sheer, impossible reality of it overwhelmed him. The scent of lavender soap and sterile linen. The feeling of her bird-like bones against his chest. He was holding the source of his existence, the central mystery of his life, and all he could feel was a sorrow so profound it felt like drowning. He was no longer Julian Croft, the architect of skylines, the titan of industry. In the sterile quiet of that room, holding his weeping, long-lost mother, he was simply the boy from the church doorstep. Finally, terribly, home. But across the room, another story was unfolding, one seen not through the lens of emotion, but through the sharp, clear focus of medical science. While Dr. Aris, the court-appointed neurologist, was documenting Eleanor's profound emotional breakthrough, Clara's gaze was fixed elsewhere. Her nursing training had taught her to see the whole patient, to read the subtle unspoken language of the body. She saw the persistent, pill-rolling tremor in Eleanor's left hand, a movement independent of her emotional state. She saw the faint, lace-like pattern of purplish mottling on her skin, a sign of poor circulation. She saw the almost imperceptible, involuntary chewing motion of her jaw. These were not the signs of simple sedation listed on the chart. They were the classic, textbook symptoms of something far more sinister. "Excuse me." Clara's voice was calm, yet it sliced through the charged atmosphere with the precision of a scalpel. She addressed the attending nurse, a woman now pale and flustered by the sudden turn of events. "The chart notes a standing order for Holdall. What is her daily dosage?" The nurse stammered the number, a dosage that made Clara's stomach clench. It was aggressive, even for an acute psychotic episode, let alone for decades of maintenance in a frail, elderly woman. "And what is she prescribed for the extrapyramidal side effects? Cogentin? Artane?" Clara pressed, her voice hardening. The nurse's blank stare was an admission of guilt. "I'm not." Dr. Miller managed her medication directly. Clara's blood ran cold. It was a deliberate, calculated omission. She turned to Dr. Aris, her expression a mixture of fury and clinical certainty. "Doctor," she said, her voice ringing with an authority that belied her student status. "She is presenting with advanced tardive dyskinesia. The tremor, the orofacial movements, the livedo reticularis on her extremities. This isn't just the fog of age or sedation. This is evidence of decades of unmanaged, high-dose antipsychotic medication. This is iatrogenic injury. They weren't just keeping her quiet. They were systematically poisoning her to induce this state." Dr. Aris's professional demeanor snapped into high alert. She moved to Eleanor, her eyes now seeing what Clara had pointed out. She gently examined Eleanor's trembling hands, her gaze sharp and analytical. The emotional reunion was now secondary to the forensic evidence of a 70-year crime. "Get me a full toxicology panel, Stat," Dr. Aris commanded the nurse. "And I want every single medical chart, every prescription order, every doctor's note on this patient since her admission in 1953. I want a paper trail." In that moment, the war shifted. The Lullaby had breached the fortress walls, but Clara's knowledge had just uncovered the scorched earth policy within. This was no longer a case of false imprisonment and emotional distress. It was a meticulously documented 70-year campaign of chemical torture. Julian Croft had come seeking a mother. Clara had just handed him the weapon that would utterly annihilate the House of Blackwood. The legal battle that followed was not a war. It was an autopsy. Sterling Blackwood's lawyers, accustomed to burying opponents under mountains of paper and procedural delays, found themselves facing an avalanche of irrefutable scientific fact. Clara's initial diagnosis was confirmed by a panel of the world's leading neurologists and pharmacologists. The 70 years of medical records, once unsealed by court order, told a horrifying story not of treatment, but of control. Every episode of agitation, every flicker of memory or rebellion had been met with an increased dosage, a chemical bludgeon to beat her spirit back into submission. The deposition of Sterling Blackwood was held not in a courtroom, but in the same cavernous library where he had declared war on Julian. The old man sat behind his monolithic desk, a pharaoh in his tomb, radiating an aura of unbreachable power. But the power was an illusion. Julian sat opposite him, with Clara by his side. He was not there to rage. His anger had been transmuted into something colder, denser, and far more dangerous. A diamond-hard resolve. "You didn't protect her," Julian began, his voice a low, even tone that filled the silent room. "You lobotomized her with a syringe, day by day, for 70 years. You did it to hide your crime." Sterling's lips curled into a sneer of breathtaking arrogance. "I did what was necessary. Eleanor was a vessel of a great legacy. She was weak, susceptible to the romantic delusions of a penniless musician. She would have thrown her life away, our name away, for a life of squalor and artistic mediocrity. I gave her peace. I gave her safety. The methods were clinical. The result was stability. You call that husk of a woman I found stability?" Julian's voice dropped further, a chilling whisper. "You call the destruction of her nervous system, the theft of her mind, peace?" "I look at you," Sterling countered, his reptilian eyes fixing on Julian, "and I see the result of my decision. You were raised in the crucible of anonymity. You fought. You built an empire. You became a man of substance, a man worthy of the Blackwood blood that, despite your unfortunate paternal lineage, flows in your veins. Had she raised you, you would be a poet or a pianist, playing for tips in some forgotten bar. I did you a favor. I made you strong." It was a masterful, monstrous piece of psychological warfare, an attempt to reframe his cruelty as a necessary catalyst for Julian's success. But it was a miscalculation. He was speaking to a man who had finally understood the hollowness of that success. "The strength you value," Julian said, leaning forward, "is the strength of a fortress, built to keep the world out. My father's strength was in his music, his ability to let the world in, to create beauty from nothing. My mother's strength was in her art, in her love for him, a love so powerful you had to spend 70 years and a pharmaceutical fortune to suppress it. You talk of legacy, but you don't understand the word. You built a dynasty of stone and stock options. They built a legacy of love, a legacy that survived in a song, a legacy that found its way back to me through the great-granddaughter of the only loyal person you ever knew. He gestured to Clara. Sterling's gaze shifted to her for the first time, a flicker of disbelief in his eyes. He saw not a nursing student, but the ghost of his long-dead servant, Martha, returned with a vengeance, armed not with a dust rag, but with the knowledge to bring down his kingdom. Clara met his gaze without flinching. Her presence in that room was the final, poetic justice. The maid's family, the ones he had threatened into silence, were now the architects of his ruin. The end came swiftly. Faced with criminal charges of medical malpractice, torture and kidnapping, and a civil suit that would strip his company bare, the Blackwood Pharmaceuticals board staged a coup. They severed all ties with their founder, leaving him a king without a kingdom. Sterling Blackwood was not defeated in a courtroom. He was rendered irrelevant. He died 2 months later, alone in that library, the final asset in his portfolio, a legacy of unparalleled monstrosity. Julian did not celebrate. There was no triumph in vanquishing a ghost. His project, his true life's work, had just begun. He sold the penthouse, the glass box in the sky, once the pinnacle of his achievement, now felt like a cage of a different sort, a monument to a solitude he no longer desired. He bought a sprawling, old stone house on the coast of Maine, a place with worn wooden floors, sprawling gardens, and windows that looked out not upon a skyline he had conquered, but upon the endless, breathing expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. This was where the slow, painful, beautiful work of reconstruction began. Eleanor's freedom was not a simple release. It was a daily, hourly battle. 70 years of institutionalization had left her terrified of open spaces, of choices, of the simple act of walking on uneven ground. Her body was a battlefield of tremors and painful muscle spasms, the lingering souvenirs of her chemical imprisonment. Julian, the man who managed 1,000-page construction plans and billion-dollar budgets, now found himself learning a new kind of architecture, the architecture of healing. He learned the precise cocktail of medications needed to counteract the damage, the rhythm of physical therapy sessions, the quiet patience required to sit with her for an hour as she struggled to remember a word. Clara was the cornerstone of this new life. Having passed her nursing boards with top honors, she declined lucrative job offers from major hospitals to oversee Eleanor's care personally. She and Julian were a team, their relationship evolving in the quiet, late-night hours, long after Eleanor and Lily were asleep. It was a bond forged not in romance, but in the shared, sacred duty of piecing a life back together. They talked over cups of tea, their conversations weaving from medication schedules to the heartbreaking fragments of memory Eleanor would sometimes share. He saw in Clara a strength and compassion that humbled him, a quiet, fierce loyalty that was a direct inheritance from her great-grandmother. He fell in love not with a sudden passion, but with a slow, dawning recognition that she and her daughter had become the irreplaceable heart of his world. For Eleanor, the world returned in sensory fragments, the scent of salt on the air, the feeling of cool, damp earth in her hands as she and Lily planted flowers in the garden, the taste of a fresh strawberry, a flavor she hadn't experienced since she was 19. Her art was the bridge back to herself. At first, her trembling hands could barely hold a piece of charcoal, but slowly, painstakingly, she began to draw again. She drew the face of Lily, a child's unburdened joy, a balm to her own stolen youth. She drew the waves crashing on the shore, and she drew Julian, not as the powerful magnate, but as the man who sat by her bedside, patiently reading her the news, his brow furrowed with a gentle concern that was the mirror image of the musician she had loved. One afternoon, nearly 2 years after her liberation, Julian found her in the sun-drenched studio he had built for her overlooking the sea. She was standing before a large canvas, her hands flecked with paint. She had finished her first painting. It was not a literal depiction of a lighthouse and a star. It was a breathtaking, impressionistic storm. A maelstrom of churning greys and deep, violent blues dominated the canvas, a sea of chaos and despair. But in the very center, there was a single, defiant point of warm, golden light. Not a beam, but a steady, unwavering glow. And high above it, scattered through a break in the storm clouds, was a constellation of 8 stars, faint but distinct, burning with a cold, clear fire. It was the Lullaby, rendered in oil and pigment. It was a story of a love that had not just weathered a storm, but had been born in the heart of it, a light that had refused to be extinguished. She turned to him, her blue eyes, once vacant, now filled with a profound, sorrowful wisdom. A small, genuine smile touched her lips. "Your father," she said, her voice still fragile but clear. "He always said that some songs aren't meant to be heard. They're meant to be lived." Julian looked at the painting, at the story of his own existence, captured in strokes of genius he now understood he had inherited. He felt Clara come up behind him, her hand finding his, their fingers lacing together in a gesture of simple, unspoken partnership. Outside, he could hear Lily's bright laughter as she chased the gulls along the shoreline. He looked around the room, at the light streaming through the windows, at the woman who was his mother, at the woman he loved, at the life he was building not from steel and glass, but from the broken pieces of the past, the hollow spaces inside him. The vast, empty cathedral he had carried his whole life were finally filled. The ghost of a melody was gone, replaced by the full, complex and beautiful symphony of home. He was no longer an architect of structures. He was the guardian of a song. And for the first time, he understood the blueprint.